Welcome to another episode of Data Skeptic Animal Intelligence. Amongst other things, today we're going to talk about the concept of object permanence. Becky, would you mind reminding listeners what that is, or maybe teaching it for the first time?
Sure. In psychology, in developmental psychology, there was a scientist, his last name is Piaget, and he was interested in developmental milestones in children. And one of them is object permanence. And generally speaking, it's a cognitive ability that develops somewhere between 6 months and a year old. It varies quite a bit in children. And what it is understanding that an object that you can't see still exists. So if you're playing with a toy with a, let's say, 4 or 5 month old baby, and you put it under a blanket, the baby doesn't pick the blanket up. They don't try to look under the blanket. They just kind of look around. They don't understand that it's still there. And once they hit that developmental milestone and they have object permanence, then if you put the object under the blanket, they're going to pick the blanket up. They understand it's still under there.
Well, I think an astute listener can deduce that some animals must be able to do this as well, otherwise it'd be a short episode. But broadly speaking, is this common, or is it rare that animals would have the concept of object permanence?
I would argue that it's very common. It's very useful to know. There's a lot of adaptive value in knowing that something is there even though you can't see it. I would argue developmentally, puppies and kittens develop much faster than human babies, so they're going to get object permanence much, much earlier. I would argue even in my tarantulas and my bumblebees, they have it as well, as the bumblebee has to remember that this flower is over here, this larva is in this cell. They have to know those things. Tarantulas, if they leave their burrow for any reason, they need to remember where that burrow is. Females need to know where their egg sacs are. Like I've seen a female tarantula back into her burrow where she couldn't see her egg sac, and then she came back out and grabbed it and then took it away with her. So I think this is very common in animals. And in terms of why we don't necessarily have it right away is a really interesting question. I'm not sure. If you look at animals that are what we call precocial, so think of like baby horses or baby chickens, they can immediately walk. Those animals I would suspect to come out of the gate with object permanence, but animals that are what we call altricial have to go through a lot more development, like humans or even puppies. They don't come out of the gate with some of these cognitive abilities.
What's the nature of the scientific debate on the topic?
Kozzy mentions that there's some ideas that maybe object permanence shows up much earlier, and I don't know the details of all those, but that would be one part of the debate. The other is not about object permanence so much, but about cognitive abilities in general. So is it that there's a neurological change in the baby and they develop object permanence, or is this associative learning? They're just learning the more they interact with their environment. So it really has nothing to do with what they can or can't understand. It's just experience. So there's this debate, are cognitive abilities like a discrete real thing, or is it a product of associative learning? And if we're starting to test things like AI and look at what things does AI actually understand, it's important to engage with that debate. Is it an ability that we're looking for, or is this going to appear if we just give a certain series of experiences?
I haven't done a complete literature search, but I'm sure someone is claiming AI has object permanence by now.
Yeah, and it seems like the tools that Kozzy's team is working on would be a good place to test that.
Absolutely. Could you give a quick summary of those tools before we start the interview?
Sure, and I downloaded this and played with it a little bit. Or actually, I used the online version because they made it in Unity. So there was a browser version. So they have made essentially a little 3D gaming environment. I think it's called Animal AI. They can run people through little puzzles. So it's just like any other video game. You walk around and you'll have a goal, like you need to get to an object or touch something. And then you get a few chances or a certain time to do that. In this case, if you write an AI to do the same goal-directed behavior and run it through these same situations multiple times, you can start to compare the AI to the people and to each other.
Yeah, it's a fascinating approach. I like that it's something practical an AI researcher can come in and build on. Do you think it's a reasonable simulacrum for actual animal behavior?
That's a good question because it's very human-based. You might be able to train something like a bird actually to use it because they have the visual and motor acuity to do something like that. But yeah, it's very much a human thing.
Oh, I meant that in a slightly different way. That not as the video game part of it, but the video game's the environment,
Right.
right? So you can put a software agent into it. And of course, software agents do all these interesting things. Even Conway's Game of Life can be this complicated thing, but Conway's Game of Life is a toy problem. You can code it up in about 100 lines of code or so. The environmental aspects of animal AI maybe make it a little bit closer to the complexity of the real world. Probably not as complex, but that as an arena where agents can be tested, of course, interesting mathematical things will come of it. But I'm wondering if we'll see sort of emergent behavior that we consider quite animal like as this moves along.
Possibly. I think it just really depends on how you frame it and discuss it. Like, there's going to be certain parts of it that emulate animals and people very well, and other parts of it that don't. So I think it's just knowing the limitations of the system.
Yeah, good insight. Well, we're going to cover the software and some of the theory and all that and more in this interview. Look, everybody, data science has been reshaping every industry, and that's not slowing down. All this AI stuff is just going to accelerate it. So whether you want to advance or pivot your career, you should consider the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business and their 100% online Business Analytics Graduate Certificate program. It'll teach you how to analyze and interpret data. The skills you learn will allow you to succeed anywhere. This online program consists of 4 courses: Business Analytics for Managers, Machine Learning for Business, Business Data Preparation and Visualization, and Analysis of Unstructured Data. It's a flexible program. You can go at your own pace. Those of you who want to hit the gas hard can take 2 courses a semester and graduate within a year. The Business Analytics Graduate Certificate is designed for professionals in any industry who want to become data-savvy leaders or pivot into analytics. It can also be your gateway into a Georgia Tech MBA. So are you ready to become a data-savvy leader? Get the skills necessary to do that. Applications for the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business Business Analytics Graduate Certificate are open now for spring 2025. Visit techgradcertificates.com to learn more. And don't forget to apply by October 1st. That's the deadline. For more information, head over to techgradcertificates.com.
Hi everyone, I'm Costandino Voudoris. I often go by Kozzy Voudoris, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. So my PhD was also at the University of Cambridge at the CFI, and continuing in this postdoctoral position. Really what I've been interested in doing is unifying the study of artificial and natural intelligence. During my PhD, I worked mostly on the evaluation of artificial intelligence, how we can determine what capabilities, particularly deep reinforcement learning agents have, cognitive capabilities, common sense capabilities like the ability to interact with objects or to understand that objects continue to exist when they go out of view, things like that, things that we might be interested in looking at in animals or infants, but turning the lens on reinforcement learning. And then in my postdoc position, I'm working now on the major transitions in the evolution of cognition project, which seeks to understand how cognition evolved from very basic organisms all the way up to humans and what major transitions were involved in that. And I'm engaged in computational modeling using tools like the animal AI environment.
Well, cool. A lot of stuff to delve deep into. Maybe this one will just be more of a footnote, but I definitely wanted to inquire, given your background on the evaluation of AI, and specifically with deep reinforcement learning. To me, the evaluation is how close your policy got to some, optimality criterion that your utility function describes. Is that the wrong way to look at it?
Yeah, so I think this is a very interesting question. And I think maybe the work we're doing at the CFI is a little ahead of the curve, especially when it comes to deep reinforcement learning, insofar as we're interested in, given a sophisticated agent that might have latent capabilities, to what extent can we robustly demonstrate that it does have those capabilities, and in what sense can we understand where it might fail or its particular failure modes that it may have. It's really about finding surprising or latent capabilities that a system that is purely training on optimizing some objective at the very abstract level, some reward function in its environment, whether that gives rise to sophisticated or surprising cognitive capabilities that are reminiscent of things we see in biological cognition. And so when we started in 2019, this was really an exciting new frontier, perhaps, for deep reinforcement learning. But now the attention has changed to large language models, which I think are showing some of these surprising latent capabilities that we might be interested in a way that perhaps these DRL agents aren't doing so much. But that's not to say that in the future, these sorts of methodologies might be useful for uncovering some of them.
Is there a formal catalog of latent capabilities? Or if not, could you give us an example or two?
There's not a formal catalog, and what we've really been drawing on is psychology, cognitive science, and in particular, developmental and comparative psychology. So those areas that are studying infants and non-human animals. My focus has been on certain common sense capabilities. Common sense is, this broad term that's used in artificial intelligence and not so much in psychology, but what we mean is real fundamental things that you would need to know or understand or be able to do in order to interact with your environment. So one key example that I focused a lot on in my PhD was object permanence. So this is the ability to understand that objects still exist when they go out of view. So can you track objects under occlusion? Can you re-identify objects post-occlusion as the same as objects pre-occlusion? And what sort of features during that occlusion event might disrupt that re-identification strategy? So this is a very fundamental common sense capability or an intuitive physics capability or capacity that has been demonstrated in neonatal infants and very young animals. But it's something that perhaps is absent in agents, deep reinforcement learning agents or other agents that are embodied in some sense. So classic use case for this particular capability is it wouldn't be very good to have a self-driving car that behaves as though objects cease to exist when they're occluded. So pedestrian passes behind a van and it suddenly behaves as though that pedestrian has disappeared from view. So drawing on cognitive science, can we evaluate robustly to what extent these embodied agents have this capability?
Would you expect that object permanence is something that has to be maybe not hard-coded in the system, but specially trained, or would you expect that it should be an emergent property?
I think, at least in the developmental and comparative literature, the focus has been on not necessarily how animals or humans come to perceive objects as continuing to exist when they go out of view, and rather, can we just detect whether an infant is able to track an object under occlusion or whether an animal is able to track an object under occlusion or not. So it's about detecting whether the capacity is there rather than trying to determine the mechanism by which that comes around. There is a bit of a debate when we step back from just detecting whether object permanence is there or not. In developmental psychology, there's some people that say, that infants come to the task with some core knowledge that's innately endowed that allows them to track objects or allows them to believe that objects continue to exist when they go out of view. They call this the principle of persistence. And then there's people on the other side who say that actually these sorts of hard-coded rules would be potentially, it's really not clear how that would be implemented in the brain or even developmentally. And so actually, perhaps it's something that's learned with some sort of structure or scaffold of heuristics that are perhaps more basic than object permanence. And so it's not out of the question that it could be something that could be learnt from first principles in a reinforcement learning sort of context. But perhaps if we want to get it to happen in a more biological-like time frame, we need to reveal what those heuristics or biases or scaffolding elements are to really get at that mechanism. So yeah, open question.
It seems that human infants at around 6 months do not have this capability, but somewhere around a year, suddenly they have it. So it wasn't part of our firmware.
Yeah, well, okay, yeah. So I think, again, this is a matter of contention in the literature. The classical experiments that have studied object permanence from the early days of developmental psychology, pioneered by Jean Piaget, he sort of demonstrated, and the neo-Piagetians demonstrated, that actually object permanence is something that arises in middle infancy, shall we say, 6 months or thereafter, 9 months, around that time. But then others who have used different behavioral probes to those that the Piagetians were using, or Piaget was using, which is, can the infant crawl towards the object and find it? Instead, if we use things like looking time, does the infant attend to objects where it expects them to be occluded, or does it attend longer to objects where it looks like you'd expect the object to reappear, but it doesn't, things like that? Actually, perhaps we see evidence for object permanence emerging much earlier and maybe even around or even pre-birth. So again, this is a debate that's happening in developmental psychology. And in comparative psychology, there's increasing evidence that even very young animals have these sorts of intuitive physics concepts. So things like object permanence have been demonstrated. If you think this is good evidence, these experiments, it's been demonstrated in day-old chicks who are newly hatched, and they appear to be able to track objects that are occluded. Whether or not it's in our firmware, as you say, or our hardware, is something that's still being actively researched. And I don't think necessarily the controversy or the debate has been settled yet.
Can you share a few details on the Evolution of Cognition project?
Yeah, so the Evolution of Cognition project is something I've recently joined since November. I was working as a research assistant. There's this grand theory in evolutionary biology that there were certain major transitions in the evolution of biological systems. Things like multicellularity. What that means is when multicellularity evolved, it suddenly opened up a wide range of phenotypic possibilities that weren't available before that transition. So a small incremental change from going single cell to multicell suddenly enables you to have this dizzying diversity of multicellular organisms. The major transitions in the Evolution of Cognition project seeks to find similarly major transitions in the context of the evolution of cognitive systems and neural systems. The principal investigators on the project, Andrew Barron, Colin Klein, and Marta Helena, the idea is that there are at least 5 of these major transitions, or they posit these 5 major transitions that opened up this wide phenotypic space in the evolution of cognitive systems. So some of those are the evolution of recurrence, so cases where activation or action potentials are traveling backwards in the network rather than a purely feed-forward process. Lamination, which is this idea that neural networks are separated out into subgroups that do their own things in parallel, and then the outputs of those laminated systems comes back together to control behavior at the individual level. And there are 3 more which I can talk about if we want to. But the general idea is that these 5 transitions were key in the stages of the evolution of neural systems, and particularly important for coming up with a theory of how complex cognition evolved in the animal kingdom.
When you look at the current state of things, and in my mind, AI is a somewhat different field from psychology. I was once scolded for saying there was no overlap, but what does the Venn diagram look like today in your mind?
In my mind, if we look at the history of the cognitive sciences and artificial intelligence, they have been intrinsically linked, or at least there are many points at which they've overlapped considerably. So I think you look at Chomsky linguistics and its basis in computationalism. There's a deep overlap there between the sorts of good old-fashioned AI that we used to have before the deep learning revolution and the sorts of theories we're positing of how language is processed and how it evolves in the brain. In more recent years, there's been a greater push for computational approaches to the study of the mind and behavior and cognition, which have drawn extensively on statistics, data science, and machine learning, which we might put under the banner of artificial intelligence. They call themselves computational cognitive scientists, and I think there is a particularly live point of intersection. But it does seem still that there's some siloing going on between people who are working in artificial intelligence and people who are working in cognitive science. I think this is to do with the goals of the respective fields. It seems like there's the more engineering spin on artificial intelligence, which is to create systems with capabilities at any cost, with as many hacks and kludges as you can include to get the job done, which has been extraordinarily effective. But that doesn't necessarily get us to a point where we are either recapitulating biological intelligence or maybe even getting close to computational systems that have the capabilities of biological systems. So there's still plenty to be done at the intersection, and that's what I hope animal AI is allowing us to facilitate.
Well, let's get straight away into it. Can you give a brief overview of what animal AI is?
The animal AI environment, it's something we've been working on at the CFI, well, even before I started, so since about 2018. And it's essentially a virtual animal laboratory. The idea is, can we build homologs of animal cognition tests, experiments that we might use with primates or birds or cephalopods, in an environment that allows them to be integrated with contemporary artificial intelligence and machine learning? our main paradigm, I suppose, of artificial intelligence that we've been drawing on is reinforcement learning, and it's very much geared to implementing reinforcement learning agents so that they can interact with the kinds of experiments that comparative psychologists, people who study animal behavior, are using in physical laboratories.
What's an example of one such experiment?
One I particularly like, and it's fairly straightforward to explain, is the so-called trap tube task. In comparative cognition, a key way that primates have been studied to understand to what extent they have an understanding of their physical world, so an intuitive physics, so an understanding of causality in their world, is to study their ability to use tools. And so what you'll have is a trap tube with some food. So it's a tube with a piece of food in it. The food is far enough away down the tube that the primate can't get at it with their fingers or with their hands. So what they have to do is use a stick to push the grape or whatever, the piece of banana, out from the other side, or to rake it towards them. And so then in a variation of this test, you introduce a trap. You have a hole at the bottom of the tube such that if you push the grape towards that hole, it's going to drop down and the primate is not going to be able to obtain the piece of food. So the question is, can the primate understand the physics of the trap tube and understand that it should go from the other side to avoid the tube, to avoid the trap, push the grape out and obtain it, or rake it towards them, avoiding the trap. So we have a version of this test in animal AI where you have a pushable block that can be pushed either left or right. And if you push the box left, you're going to push this green reward into an inaccessible zone. We call them a lava zone, and you'll die. So you'll get negative points. If you push it the other way, you're going to push a different reward out into an accessible zone. If you understand the physics of the environment, that if you, or the causal mechanisms involved in the environment, whereby pushing the tool one way will cause the goal to be in an inaccessible area and not pushing it the other way, then we can say something meaningful about the intuitive physics of the systems in this environment, or at least we can conceptually replicate that particular experiment. Several of the experiments we have in animal AI are to do with physical reasoning, spatial reasoning, and very much about tool use and reasoning about objects during occlusion, counting certain objects and things like that.
Well, I know how a animal researcher would conduct this. They would create a physical space, they would get an actual specimen and put it in there.
Yep.
What is your specimen and how does it decide what to do?
The agent is embodied in the environment. It has a small set of actions it can perform, so it can go forwards, backwards, it can rotate left and right. It's a classic reinforcement learning setup, really. So we have the agent receives an observation from the state of the environment, and then it also receives, it is then able to perform an action, and in return it receives some reward signal. And it's a very sparse reward space, because usually you're not getting the reward till the very end, or you're losing small amounts of reward as time passes. Then what we do is we would train the agent according to some curriculum, trying to recapitulate either the kinds of curricula we might expect to use in an animal cognition task with a primate, or some more bespoke curriculum for whatever empirical question we're interested in. And then we would test it on this final experiment. Open questions when it comes to reinforcement learning is, what curricula are appropriate? To what extent is it fair to train the agent on the test? To what extent is it unfair to not train the agent on the test? Various other questions about the architectures that we're using. But the general idea is to have a library of such tasks so that we can start asking these questions and start running these sorts of empirical experiments to determine to what extent reinforcement, like studying reinforcement learning in this way, is useful or allows commensurability or comparability with biological cognition, and in what respects there's some differences there that are somehow irreducible that limit that comparison or make that comparison unfair.
Well, in many reinforcement learning situations, there's some noise incorporated in that I might not have perfect observability, or even my actions might not perfectly achieve the goal I wanted. They would with some probability. Is there anything probabilistic in your model of the agent?
So in terms of the environment itself, it's certainly only receiving, so it's partially observable environment. It's three-dimensional. The agent it's got a face, it's facing a certain direction, and it receives the pixel input from the direction it's facing, which can be parameterized. But it's really a still of what the agent can see directly in front of it, so it can't observe what's behind it. and it can't observe, when things are getting occluded. So it's partially observable in that sense. In terms of probabilistic, no, it's a deterministic environment insofar as we're reliant on Unity and the Unity physics engine, game engine that we've designed it. So at base, barring any sort of variability we get from the physics environment itself, it's deterministic, but that's not to say that we can't introduce noise. We can't introduce random actions every few steps, or we can't occlude certain parts of the observation space, things like that, which we haven't done in any of our studies so far, but it's certainly something that would be interesting to look at.
So you've got pixel values as your input features. That's the set of observations you get about the world.
Yeah.
What goes into the decision of what action to take? How do you model the agency, I guess?
At the moment, we have integration with many of the standard reinforcement learning libraries. So we use off-the-shelf algorithms to run our agents. So things like proximal policy optimization, more recently Dreamer version 3, which is a more model-based approach to deep reinforcement learning. But the general idea with these is that you receive an episode of observation, action, reward, observation, action, reward, etc., and you receive that sequence. The idea is to converge on a policy that produces the right trajectory of actions so as to maximize the reward in the environment by the end of the episode. There are several reinforcement and deep reinforcement learning approaches to doing that use different tips and tricks to converge on these policies and hopefully converge on some optimal policy that allows them to interact with these environments in some meaningful way.
Well, if you apply deep reinforcement learning to chess and the utility function is always 0 unless you've won and then it's a 1, I know that presents challenges because you're going to rarely random walk into a win. So usually there's like a board evaluation function you're optimizing or something along those lines. In your scenario, it's do I pass the tube test, yes or no? How do you represent the utility?
There's a reward signal that evolves over time. So after every action, the agent receives a reward, or it receives the current reward value of the environment. And usually that's negatively decrementing until they obtain some food reward, so a big green or big yellow thing that's supposed to be emulating some kind of food in the environment. And so there's this reward signal, which is the objective. And the objective is to optimize usually the reward on the final step of the episode, or at least the cumulative reward over the course of the episode. That's the thing we want to improve on. So you can start off taking random actions and you're probably going to end up with a value of -1 because your time's run out. But every now and again, you take the right action and it means you hit the green reward directly in front of you, and that gives you a reward of +1. As you start with this end-to-end architecture of going, right, okay, I have my sequence of observations, I have my sequence of actions, and then I have my reward at the end of the episode, or even my distribution of rewards by the end of the episode, across the whole episode. What's predictive of higher reward over my training across several episodes? Well, it's when green is directly in front of me, it usually works to move forward one step, and then I get a reward of +1. And so the policy then becomes, in response to green pixels in front of you, take the forwards action rather than the backwards action.
Well, if your goal was purely to create agents that were really good at spatial reasoning, in addition to all the pixel values, it might be useful to give them some coordinate system.
Yeah.
Although my brain does not have a built-in GPS, so maybe that's not a fair apples-to-apples comparison. Is the pixel values the entirety of what you give in, or have you considered other external features?
As a broader observation space, so we can have the coordinates of the agent at the particular time step and the velocities of the agent at the particular time step. These are nice to include. My main interest for those has been for data analysis after the fact, because we can use the coordinates of the agent on the time step to map the trajectory the agent took during play. But it's also a possible observation. But like you say, it's somewhat less meaningful for that comparison to biological agents. Although I guess it gets at something like proprioception, or maybe in some of the ant navigation literature where they have to do path analysis or whatever it's
Pheromones.
called. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe there's something there where it's useful. So it's offered as a possible observation. The final kind of observation we have, which allows you to get a simpler reinforcement learning problem, is we've implemented these raycasts. And what raycasts do is the agent shoots out rays directly from it, and they can have infinite length, so they can go and touch whatever is in the arena, and it returns a value of what it sees directly in front of it according to some ontology of objects that we have in the environment. So is there a good goal in that spot right ahead of me? Is there some lava or a death zone to my left? Is there a wall to my right? And things like that. And that provides a much simpler observation space than using pixels, because pixels, you have the height and the width of the image and then the number of color channels. So it becomes quite a large problem to your neural network. Input space is very big, whereas we can reduce it to this simpler matrix of whether or not there's an object of a certain kind in a particular position at that state. And that allows us to run much more sophisticated experiments where we get much more interesting results that our computational resources allow, shall we say. Which is more interesting. But I guess the animals are doing it with purely visual input rather than this sort of object mask over the observation. So it's more meaningful to have comparisons to agents with visual input. But we have that raycasting as another option.
Well, we've seen over the last, 10 years or so that the more computational power you can pump into language models, the better they seem to get. Do you think the same opportunity exists here, or will reinforcement learning hit a ceiling because of some clever methodology we're missing or something?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, I suppose I'm not a reinforcement learning specialist, so I don't necessarily want to comment on the trajectory of the field or where it's going in terms of ceilings. But I do think that the role of compute has been demonstrated with reinforcement learning in a similar way to large language models. So there's some papers that have come out of DeepMind, like from the adaptive agents team. They had a very large meta reinforcement learning agent that had a attention-based mechanism in how it learned the policy, and they trained it for billions of time steps on a very complex environment, and they found surprising latent capabilities, including, they say, some evidence of things like object permanence and adaptation to new contexts on a more human-like timescale. So I think there is certainly a role to play for just upping the compute, upping the dimensionality of your input, and we might get surprising capabilities emerging from that. But I don't necessarily think that this solution has legs in terms of getting us towards something that's more human-like or more biological, in terms of something that can learn on a biological-like timescale. I think there has to be, and this is my cognitive science colors coming through, there has to be more scaffolding. I think we're not acknowledging in reinforcement learning, at least, or in this deep learning, machine learning age, the role of what evolution and genetics have endowed us in terms of scaffolding for learning. The work that some cognitive sciences are doing in elucidating the kinds of biases and heuristics that infants and young animals come to the task with is going to be super important for determining how we might scaffold these very powerful approaches like reinforcement learning so that they can learn on a more human-like timescale, on a more animal-like timescale, and learn behaviors that are as sophisticated as what we see in the animal kingdom.
Can you describe who a typical user of animal AI is?
We're trying to serve two communities with animal AI. So it's come out of an interdisciplinary collaboration between my supervisors and their collaborators, comparative psychologists, my supervisor Lucy Cheek, and philosophers of science, my other supervisor Marta Helena, along with computer scientists and engineers and biologists. And the idea is, how can we build a research tool that's useful for both cognitive scientists, in particular comparative cognitive researchers, and artificial intelligence researchers? And maybe it's worth covering what I think the benefits for those two communities would be. So when it comes to artificial intelligence, we have this idea that the way at least reinforcement learning is done could learn a lot from how biological learning is done. And so if we can break through those silos and encourage and accelerate collaboration between these two communities, maybe we'll be able to produce some more sophisticated architectures or some more human-like architectures. That's the first thing. The second thing for AI is that it facilitates a more nuanced, more scientific, in my opinion, type of AI evaluation. In recent years, I think it's come to light that the kind of practice of benchmarking in artificial intelligence, where we take some large data set off the internet, don't really know what's in it, and we run our new agent on it, and we distill out a nice number that says my agent got 90% on this benchmark, and my competitor's agent got 85%, and therefore I'm better at capability XYZ that this benchmark purports to test. I think that's pretty clear that that's quite a blunt instrument for when we're trying to determine or map out the capabilities of these systems, what they're good at and what they're bad at, and which ways they might fail. And so by bringing in comparative cognition, where they've carefully designed experiments for studying things like common sense reasoning in systems that are very different to humans, i.e. non-human animals, that in some respects are alien technologies, we're able to capitalize on the sort of evaluation methods of the cognitive sciences and try to improve how we evaluate artificial systems. These are two key benefits for the AI community. And then the cognitive science community, in particular comparative cognition, can benefit from the precise computational methods that are coming out of the computational sciences to build more precise theories. So in comparative cognition and developmental psychology, there's often this big polemic between people that will say things like, oh, for the chimpanzee to successfully pass this tool use task, it must have intuitive physics and it must be able to model its physical world and understand cause and effect. And then there'll be naysayers or killjoys who will say something like, oh, well, that could actually just be explained by this associative learning account where they had some experience and through trial and error, they learned that like using the tool to push the grate this way or like of going to the side that avoids the trap is in some sense more rewarding. And so they learn just through associative learning how to do that through operant conditioning or something like that. The problem with these sorts of things is that they're often stated at this more abstract level, potentially a more verbal level. They're verbally stated theories. They don't necessarily issue out precise predictions. What does it mean for a chimpanzee to simulate its physical environment or to understand cause and effect reasoning? In many cases, a precisely stated model for what that would look like and how that would be different to something like associative learning, which is more like reinforcement learning. By introducing computational models, which are by their nature more precisely stated, they issue out predictions that are more precise and allow us to divide the world into, okay, this is what it would look like if my theory is right, and this is what the world would look like if my theory was wrong. Then hopefully we can start to move on from these stagnating debates in comparative cognition and move towards a more computational future there and a more precise understanding of how animals are behaving and not just this blunt comparison of this animal has object permanence and this animal does not have object permanence. And this has been super fruitful in human psychology, in the computational cognitive sciences, involving things like Bayesian statistics and the whole idea of the Bayesian brain and modeling human behavior using neural networks and machine learning models has been particularly fruitful in cognitive science in humans and in neuroscience. And so why not bring that to comparative cognition as well?
Well, we talked about the trap tube task. There are at least 899 other tasks, though. I'm not going to ask you to list them all, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about the Animal AI Olympics.
Yes, the Animal AI Olympics. So this was something that started in 2019. So development started in 2018 before I started at the CFI, and it was led by Matt Crosby and Murray Shanahan and Lucy Cheek and other colleagues at the CFI. And the idea was, let's have a competition where we implement common comparative cognition tasks in the animal AI environment. We don't tell the world what those tasks are. And then we open a competition, the Animal AI Olympics, to the world to say, submit your agents, see if you can pass tasks that are straightforward for many animals to solve, or that in the more complex cases like the trap tube task, that some animals have been demonstrated or observed to pass. So in 2019, I think it was about 60 teams submitted their agents. They were evaluated privately on the 900 test battery, and then the results were announced. The battery, the Olympics, the test bed, as we call it, it spans a whole range of kinds of tasks. So very simple tasks like goal-directed tests of goal-directedness. So can your agent go towards good things and can it avoid bad things? These are very simple things that maybe we wouldn't even test in non-human animals because it's blatantly obvious that an animal is going to avoid fire and go towards tasty fruit. But at least, or these are the sorts of things that would be tested in pre-training or in the build-up to a real experiment. And then from there, things like preferences. So do you prefer bigger, like more rewarding objects to smaller rewarding objects. So this is testing for preferences. Can you do that when there's a forced choice? If you go left towards the smaller rewards, you're not going to be able to go back and get the large reward, all the way up to things like, can you count? So can you tell the difference between there's 4 rewards on the left and there's 1 reward on the right? So this is something called numerosity, which has been studied extensively on human animals. And then tool use and object permanence are probably at the top end of the complexity spectrum. Roughly 10 levels of that correspond to different sorts of experimental paradigms in the literature, each containing 90 tasks or 30 tasks with 3 variations of each. So it's quite comprehensive, and it's this library that's still out there and still waiting to be used. So if people are interested in running agents on them and seeing how they compare to biological intelligence, then that would be great. But crucially, in the Olympics, it was out of distribution. So the developers did not know what exactly the agents were going to be tested on. So this was a surprising outcome that the agents were still able to do well on these unseen tasks in the Olympics. But we later found that children on the exact same tests using the animal AI environment do way, way better than these reinforcement learning agents, which I suppose is quite humbling for, yeah.
So if I were to have submitted an agent, did I need to submit a sort of general multimodal agent that could perform well at all tasks, or does it train on each task individually, or what was the process like?
No, so each developer was tasked to train their own agent. So they develop the architecture and then they train their own agent on the curriculum as they choose to design it. The top 2 agents, Iron Bar and True, were trained on bespoke curricula. We're not quite sure exactly what they were trained on. It's possible that one of them was trained on randomly generated arenas, and then they were submitted for testing. So there's still open questions about whether we could get better performance on certain subtasks if we trained on a more bespoke curriculum that somehow incrementally progressed towards the task itself, or whether it's just a matter of number of training steps and just train for ages on randomly generated arenas and you'll get better performance.
So I imagine you saw a variety of approaches, or maybe you don't know if they just gave you the policy, who knows how they arrived at it. But
yeah.
Could you walk us through the typical workflow one of those submissions had to follow, from maybe first cloning the environment and or the GitHub repo? How'd they go from step 1 to the submission?
Back in the day, so this was, this would have been just before my time. So I'll try and get the details correct. So as far as I remember, it would have been clone the repository, which had step-by-step instructions. And what you do is clone the repository, which had various helper scripts for getting set up with the environment, implementing a very basic agent, playing some environments yourself as a human player. Download, you have to download the environment separately because it's a separately built Unity build that is specific to your particular OS. Put it in the right place so that your scripts can find it, and then start implementing an agent as you see fit. The general structure is that Animal AI is implemented with 2 APIs for training agents. So we have the more basic low-level API, which runs on Unity's ML Agents package, which is much more, gets into the nuts and bolts of the environment, but basically that returns at each time step the observation and then the reward. You can then use that to train whatever architecture you want. So if you were trying to implement some deep reinforcement learning agent, you would take the observation and try to predict one of the 9 actions as an output, whilst optimizing it so that it's maximizing reward over the episode. So we have the very low-level API, which allows you to have much more control over what's going on. And then we have a wrapper that allows you to integrate it with more standard deep reinforcement learning packages. So it's integrated with Gymnasium. And that allows you to not only write something that's gym-friendly yourself, but also integrate it with things like stable baselines and various other architectures that are out there that are implemented with Gym. You can then do some more. You can just get to sort of hyperparameter tuning of the agent itself rather than building, say, a PPO agent from scratch. I think the top 2 agents were bespoke PPO agents, proximal policy optimization. Can't remember whether they were, I don't know whether they were ML agents or Gymnasium or Gym back in the day. they used some bespoke implementations that allowed them to get a bit better performance than maybe a vanilla PPO agent would have got. So one agent was actively given some reward for finding vertical velocities. So when its velocity was not zero in the y dimension, so up and down, it got some small reward. And what that meant was that it learned to seek out ramps, which just so happened to be key to a lot of the tests that it was then evaluated on, because a lot of the tests we used involved the agent going over some ramp or down some ramp to find a reward. And if it didn't go up or down the ramp, then it would usually fail. So this was like a useful addition to the standard setup that allowed it to do something above and beyond the other agents in the field.
Well, what's next for the project?
So we're continuing to develop the project. So we've just released Animal AI version 3. There are many more new objects and functionalities in the environment than there were when we ran the Olympics. And this is the result of countless people's effort over the past 3 years. We're hoping to continue building it and making it more useful and more applicable to the research being done in reinforcement learning and the cognitive sciences. It's still alive, it's still being developed. We're now looking into some of these open questions that we're interested in, which are how do different curricula affect learning when we control for the same architecture and training time? Can we get improvements when we have a sort of staged learning from some very simple tasks to more complex tasks? Can we get something where there's a more auto-curriculum design? This is something that comes up in developmental psychology a bit, that children tend to structure their learning materials around them so that they are learning about things that are just at the edge of their knowledge rather than anything that's too far beyond that. So is there a way that we can implement that in a way that the training curriculum is responding to what the agent appears to be good at or bad at? And then moving forwards to try to contribute some of our own bespoke architectures. So there's been some work in Imperial related to our lab that has been focused on implementing more biological algorithms for learning that have come out of the associative learning literature to see if we can get more animal-like behavior, or at least start testing associative learning theories within the animal AI environment. And then something we're very interested in doing is moving towards large language model agents. So agents where the observation is passed to either as some textual description of what the observation contains, using raycasts or something like that, or passing the image itself to a multimodal large language model, which can then produce actions or a series of actions to then perform in the environment, and see if we can get closer to, if we can improve on the state of the art as defined by the Olympics. And get improved performance on some of these common sense reasoning tasks out of distribution. So that's all we're working on at the moment. But there's lots of things happening.
So are you going to do the Olympics every 4 years, or how's that going to work?
Yeah, that's a great idea. From what I heard from the postdocs who led the project back in 2019, it was a lot of work to evaluate this number of agents and keep everything hidden. I would love to do that, but it sounds like it's more than a one-man job. So this is a call for collaboration if people would like to do something like that. Another option is to maybe put out bounties, benchmark bounties that would, so for the particular subtasks, can you build an agent that performs well at object permanence out of distribution, and let the community sort of contribute rather than running a competition ourselves. But yeah, we'll see what happens down the line. It seems like the spotlight has moved from reinforcement learning to large language models for the time being, which is a shame, but hopefully the spotlight will move back and
yeah, the pendulum may swing.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Very cool. Well, where can listeners go to follow the project and maybe yourself online?
Listeners can go to www.animalai.org to learn more about the project and its history. And to look at the code base, you can head to our organization, Kinds of Intelligence CFI, on GitHub. And in there, we have a repository, Animal AI repository, which is your jumping off point for getting started with the project and downloading it onto your machines and having a play around.
Very cool. We'll have links in the show notes for listeners who want to follow up. Kozzy, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your work.
Thank you very much, Kyle. It's been great fun.